economic truths have become accepted as self-evident. A second Bill of Rights, under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station or race or creed. Among these are the right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines throughout the nation. The right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation. The right of every farmer to raise and sell his product at a return which will give him and his family a decent living. The right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom, freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad. The right of every family to a decent home. The right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health. The right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment. The right to a good education. All of these rights spell security.
Welcome to United Front Radio, the voice of New Deal America. We're exploring the ideas that made America great and how we can implement them today. This is Daniela Walls, chair of the Tax Wall Street Party, and Kyle McCarthy, founding member of the United Front Against Austerity. We believe that right now Americans need to come together to protect what's left of our economic rights. Needy people are not free people. The purpose of United Front Radio is to create a dialogue about our current economic crisis that is being perpetuated by both political parties. We are demanding a set of reforms including a 1% Wall Street sales tax and nationalizing the Federal Reserve. These are solutions to protect our social safety net and create millions of jobs by rebuilding our aging infrastructure. Tonight, we're reporting from America's heartland, Nebraska. This is ground zero of the Dan Burdorf campaign for U.S. Senate on the Tax Wall Street Party ticket. Dan's running against the Wall Street insider, Republican golden boy Ben Sasse. To learn more about Dan's campaign, please visit danfornebraska.com. Today's show is called The New Puritans, where we're going to be looking at a couple of rising Republican stars potentially poised to become leaders in the GOP. We need to know who these people are. A new pattern is developing in American politics, and it's nothing but dangerous for the lives of most Americans, particularly working Americans, and the future of our economy is at stake, and our civil rights. Specifically, we're going to be examining Ben Sasse, currently running for U.S. Senate in Nebraska, and Dave Brat, who just unseated Eric Cantor in a major upset in the Virginia primary. These two, Sasse and Brat, have a particularly disturbing austerity agenda. We're going to explore what that agenda is, particularly Sasse, because it seems he's potentially the 2016 presidential candidate that can bridge the gap between the radical Tea Party and the GOP. This is a split that, as we know, threatens to take down the Republican Party permanently. So far, no candidate has emerged who can appeal to these two factions of the right wing until the arrival of Ben Sasse, who may be groomed for that role. We will also be looking at Dave Brat. Who is Dave Brat? We know he's a Catholic, a Calvinist, and a libertarian. We're going to look specifically at what Calvinism is and how its ideas have historically been used as political weapons. Most people probably don't know what Calvinism is. Essentially, it puts people into two categories: the saved and the damned. Unfortunately, according to the Calvinists, most of us are damned. Both Ben Sasse and Dave Brat are Calvinists and libertarians. Specifically, they are pushing the Ayn Rand radical libertarianism backed by the Koch brothers. So what this means politically is that they are embodying the rise of a new radical theocratic libertarianism. That is, by all standards, unchristian and just plain barbaric. To supplement this show, please read Kyle McCarthy's article titled The New Puritans at againstausterity.org. Our candidate on the Tax Wall Street Party ticket, Dan Burdorf, happens to be running against one of these new Puritans, Ben Sasse. On top of this, we believe that we are not fighting a regional battle here in Nebraska. All evidence we've uncovered points to the fact that Ben Sasse could be the chosen one to run for 45th President of the United States as a Republican. And Ben Sasse could be the 45th President if the Republicans mimic the Obama model and run Sasse after only a year in the Senate. So get ready for the next Manchurian candidate, Ben Sasse. Ben Sasse and his doppelganger David Brat are not the outsiders portrayed in the media from mainstream to alternative. They are something, in fact, very dangerous and come from the highest levels and darkest places inside our government. They are both insiders with dark money written all over them. Kyle and I have been cooperating on some very serious research about all this. Our sound quality is going to get a little rough for the rest of the show because Kyle can only be on his cell phone tonight, but I know you'll stay with us for this important discussion. So Kyle, let's start.
A lot of people are celebrating Dave Brat's victory in Virginia, not just the Tea Party, even people like Ralph Nader or John Nichols of The Nation, people like that see this as a sign of this new Republican populism. And people have a good reason to dislike Eric Cantor, but the analysis I'm seeing so far falls short.
The question is, was this really independent populism, or the establishment disguising itself once again?
Right. And I think we really need to get into what Brat believes in terms of policy. And when we first started looking into Brat, it set off so many alarm bells based on what we've been discovering about Ben Sasse in Nebraska.
Just to be clear, we're going to be doing a lot of jumping around tonight between Brat and Sasse, almost as if they're the same guy because they have nearly identical resumes.
Right. There's an article in the Washington Post on June 13th, right after the Brat victory. This is a couple days before I put the New Puritans article up on our website at againstausterity.org. And the Post article was called, David Brat's Victory Comes with a Rise in the Crossroads of Religion and Economics. The article identified a similar pattern to what we're talking about, and I think they talk about it and Brat talks about it as Christian populism being a response to the economic depression. And the Washington Post doesn't really explain the purpose of this. Even Ralph Nader, who should know better, doesn't explain it. They're all missing a key point, which is that Christian populism, in the way that Sasse and Brat are going to use it, is a fraud. It's really just a sanctimonious excuse for austerity. And what I try to argue in the article is that these candidates represent a new strategy to save not only the Republican Party, but the so-called grand bargain.
Austerity is the antithesis of anything that Jesus ever preached in the Gospels. I saw this great clip on YouTube where a gentleman chases down Mitt Romney's vice presidential candidate, Paul Ryan, who believes the gospel to be more Ayn Rand than Jesus Christ. And he chases down Ryan and gives him a copy of the Bible. I wish some Christian populists would have the Bible actually influence them more than Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah, and it's the thing that's interesting is their brand of Christianity is compatible with Ayn Rand. What I found in researching Sasse and Brat is not so much that they're liars who love Jesus with one hand and are going to take your Social Security check with the other. It's more that their whole theological outlook is an attack on government. Let's take a look at the resumes to see what we're dealing with, and especially highlighting the importance of this intersection between religion and politics.
Just to recap, we are talking about the rise of a new radical theocratic libertarianism and how Calvinism in religion is influencing that process. And this is where dangerous religion intersects with politics. So I'm going to read Ben Sasse's resume. He has a Harvard undergrad thesis on Martin Luther and just war theory. He did a master's thesis at St. John's in Annapolis, the notorious incubator school for neocons. His master's thesis was on John Calvin and the law. And finally, his PhD thesis, called The Anti-Madeleine Majority, has been described as a playbook for politically mobilizing a supposed silent majority of Protestants who've been cut out of politics by Washington elites. And after his undergrad, he was executive director of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, where he even edited New Reformation magazine and the book Here We Stand, A Call for a Modern Reformation. He currently serves as director of the Westminster Theological Seminary, an organization that proclaims, among other things that we will get into, that the Pope is the Antichrist. So, religion is not a pastime for Ben Sasse, and it is not a pastime for Dave Brat.
Right. Sasse calls himself, quote-unquote, a private sector guy, and you wouldn't really know from watching him on TV that religion has a whole lot to do with his campaign. But in fact, his time in the private sector is very brief. He only does about a year with McKinsey and Company and the Boston Consulting Group, which are both part of the vulture capitalism apparatus. His career in government is very impressive, and starting as a congressional chief of staff right out of his master's degree.
That is very weird that a theological student's first job out of a master's is chief of staff to a representative, in this case Fortenberry, because usually a chief of staff is somebody that knows the Hill better than the representative and comes from a legal or political science background.
Exactly. And he also advised the Department of Homeland Security. He was very high up, I think number 2 at the Department of Justice. Again,
without a law degree. This is a red flag. How do you get to number 2 at DOJ so quickly without a law degree?
Right, in their Office of Legal Policy, where he was the liaison between the FBI and the CIA.
That's the shocker, that he was the liaison between the FBI and CIA, while the marketing makes him seem like a farmer. And look at his website, sassfornebraska.com. It has Field of Dreams imagery. He's standing in a wheat field at dusk. He's no small-town boy. He's a spook.
After DOJ, he goes on to be the principal policy advisor to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which is the largest federal department.
At that point, he is still a young guy, in his 30s, when he headed our largest federal department. He is only 42 now. How did all this happen in such a short period of time? His resume is so extensive.
Right. He's really been run through the ringer in Washington, and you get the sense that he's being groomed, as is Dave Bratt. So Dave Bratt, his undergrad is at Hope College, which is a Protestant college in western Michigan, where you've got Calvin College and a very strong Calvinist influence over the whole area. Then he goes on to Princeton Theological Seminary, where he gets a Master's of Divinity. And then he goes and gets his PhD in economics at American University, where all of his academic papers have these titles like Science and Religion in the 19th Century, An Analysis of the Moral Foundations of Ayn Rand, Can Theological Types Handle Usury and Capitalism? And he's exploring all this as an academic now, where he works at Randolph-Macon College in Virginia. But also just his whole academic background is this intersection of religion and economics.
I had never heard of Randolph-Macon College before researching Dave Bratt, and it turns out this small college is the recipient of a lot of dark money from billionaires pushing the Ayn Rand agenda. Bratt is the chair of Macon's economics department and also heads the BB&T Ethics Institute. This is one of a number of BB&T Ethics Institutes set up at colleges ranging from Georgetown, the University of Virginia, all the way down to little Randolph-Macon. And the guy who set this all up, BB&T, was bank CEO John Allison, who is now the president of the Cato Institute, which is, of course, we know was established by Charles Koch to spread libertarian ideas into academia.
Yeah, and it's not new. One book everybody should check out, and I found this at my local public library, is called Invisible Hands. It's by an NYU professor named Kim Phillips-Fein. It shows that just the whole conservative movement in this country, going back to the 30s and 40s, is, number one, it's an attack on the New Deal explicitly. And number two, it's funded from top to bottom by oligarchs. People might have heard of this thing called the Mont Pelerin Society, founded by all these godfathers of libertarianism like von Hayek and von Mises and Karl Popper, Milton Friedman, people all like this. Well, guess who turns out was funding all these guys? It was the DuPont family, the Volcker family, the Rockefeller Foundation. It was, just huge billionaire money is funding libertarian economics. This Ludwig von Mises, who Ron Paul and all the libertarians are going to tell you is this great economist and no one appreciates him and blah, blah, blah. He never held a paid position in academia in America because he was funded in the exact same way that Dave Bratt is being funded by these endowed positions. Bratt has John Allison paying his bills, and von Mises had David Rockefeller.
Kyle, that makes me nuts. That patriotic Americans, many of whom have lost their jobs and standard of living because of billionaires on Wall Street like these, are being duped into getting behind a foreign economic system, the Austrian school, when we have our own economic system called the American system. It's like, get with it, people. Libertarianism was the invention of foreign oligarchs. It's time to learn about the American system of political economy. that was responsible for your once great standard of living. If you want that standard of living back, then it's time to wake up and do some research. Start by Googling the American system of political economy. Kyle, you said in the New Puritans article at againstausterity.org that Sass and Bratt are both parked now after coming out of high-level government positions at small colleges. My research shows that this is a typical political holding pattern. After Eisenhower was Supreme Allied Commander, then he became a university president, and then he became president. Woodrow Wilson was the president of Princeton before he was president. Kyle, my academic background, as you know, is in theology, like Bratt and Sass, and I don't know a single classmate of mine who went on to any position in law, government, or business consulting. Sass and Bratt's academic resumes are that of aspiring theologians, period. Again, how did Sass go from a PhD in theology, not law, to head the Department of Justice? And how did Bratt go from theology to the World Bank? This only makes sense if these guys are seen as operatives. It only makes sense if something else is going on. Kyle, where is David Petraeus now? Do you know?
City University of New York, CUNY.
But CCNY had that big protest against Petraeus. Remember those big protests when we were running Randy Credico for mayor of New York?
So he's out of there now, I think.
I thought the students ousted him, but I'm not quite sure.
He's at KKR, which is sort of like Blackwater.
The students, rightfully so, didn't want a war criminal teaching at their college. And with him came the military recruiters to try to recruit some of the poorer students. And they said a college is a place for learning, not for being recruited. So let's get back to Ben Sass and Dave Bratt being insider government operatives.
Yeah, I think that's the only way to see it. If the goal was politics, if he wants to be at the Department of Justice, why did he not study law, or political science at least? You look at their resumes, these guys just spend a very brief time in the private sector. They're sort of put immediately into these very high-level government jobs. With Bratt, we didn't mention that he consulted the World Bank, USAID, Army Research Institute, but they little tiny stint with the private sector, and then between them dozens of years studying how to justify their political behavior through the lens of Calvin or Luther or Ayn Rand.
It seems as if somebody or something dipped these theologians into government and business positions, almost to train them up. It seems as if they have both, especially Ben Sass, been groomed from the very start. Oh, and that brings me to that New York Times comment I found from an anonymous woman named Rebecca. You know, Kyle, that this comment really spoke to me given all the research we'd been doing. I'd even like to post a screenshot of that comment on our website at againstausterity.org. But for now, I think it's important to at least read it, because it plays into the idea of Ben Sass being a Manchurian candidate from the start. So Rebecca writes, I met Ben Sass during high school and never forgot him. He introduced himself as the 45th president who would go to Yale and then run for office as a Republican. I told a friend about this who called me up after her first week at Harvard to say she met a guy who said he was going to be the 45th president. Looks like 45th won't happen, but God help us if he even gets close. And that was the end of the comment. I'm not so sure that 45th won't happen if the establishment follows the Obama model and runs him only after a year or two in the Senate. Kyle, Sass was number 2 at the Department of Justice when the Iraqi torture memos were written. How does his so-called religion justify torture? I don't know a single Christian that isn't disgusted by the idea of torture.
Well, there's the esoteric and then there's the exoteric, and I think we'll get to the esoteric of Calvinism, but in terms of Sass's public persona, I think the thing that's interesting is how is the perception of being deeply religious, how is that going to shape his public persona, and how is he going to use this to influence the public?
Yes, once again, image used to influence the public mind. I watched Bratt's acceptance speech on YouTube where he credits God for the win, and a man wrote in the comments section, only a courageous man speaks about his faith in public. My point being that people are already projecting their own values onto these guys.
So Dave Bratt calls himself a Catholic Calvinist libertarian, and a lot of people have been scratching their heads at that one because those things are mutually exclusive. Calvinism at its core is a virulent reaction against the Catholic Church. And Ben Sass is not only a Lutheran, but if we look into his background, he's clearly a Calvinist. You mentioned the book that he wrote with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Calvinism, I would say, it's not so much a religion as a set of principles that are within various Protestant religions. Like, you could be a Calvinist Lutheran or a Presbyterian or a Methodist. You can also be a non-Calvinist to any of those things. So these things, they're not synonymous.
Please tell us what these principles are. I'm very curious.
Okay, so Sass edits this book, Here We Stand, the Call for a Modern Reformation. It's organized around the 5 pillars of Calvinist doctrine, which are sola scriptura, which means basically scriptural literalism. Jesus says, love thy neighbor, and the book of Esther says, kill all the Persians. And, the Calvinist preacher gets to decide which one is valid, I guess. And this should be familiar from George Bush and Christian Zionism, which actually seems to be, thankfully, a waning movement. And then number 2, sola fide, which means faith alone. This is pretty important in Calvinism. And Sass basically describes it as it condemns any attempt to please God through your good works. It's only through God's favor that you're saved. Forget about your own behavior. You can't get yourself in or out of hell. Number 3, sola gratia, which is grace alone. It's pretty much the same idea. Here's a quote from Sass, and keep in mind this is the leading candidate for the U.S. Senate in Nebraska. This guy could very well become one of 100 senators in the U.S.
Yeah.
He writes, God owes sinners nothing but punishment for their sins, and if he saves them in spite of their sins, as he does in the case of those that are saved, it's only because it pleases him to do it. Calvinists are known for this thing called double predestination. God has already chosen those who are saved and those who are damned. So, some of us are going to hell and some are going to heaven, no matter what you do one way or the other.
It means that any bad stuff you do is excused if you're one of the saved. And if you're one of the damned, then forget it. There's nothing you can do to save yourself, and there is no use helping you. If you are not saved by their definition, then there's no reason anybody else should, a charity or especially the government. And Calvinism strikes me as a very unchristian outlook in the way that most people understand Christianity. This is very similar to an Indian caste system. It's not American.
Sure. I mean, you can see the caste mentality in the Old Testament. I mean, it's Orthodox Judaism or Mormonism. Calvin's contemporaries, John Calvin, for whom it is named, his contemporaries called him a Judaizer because he used this Old Testament outlook to justify usury and a lot of other bad things. Go to Google, if you're listening, and look for an article about Calvin by Murray Rothbard, who's another one of these well-loved Austrian school economists, and he defends Calvin from this standpoint, writes about how he had the courage to finally bring usury back into practice.
Well, isn't that just special?
Yeah. I mean, Calvin's doctrines they're really like the theological fuel for the Dutch and British empires. So the other 2 solas are solus Christus, which is no merit on the part of man can add to Christ's completed saving work. And then sola Deo Gloria, which is all glory to God alone. So these just kind of underscore this idea that it's all God, it's all Jesus, forget you.
Can you explain that idea further? Jesus did it and forget you? Because I'm having a really hard time grasping what that fully means.
The idea, to contrast it with what most people would think of Christian doctrine, Christ is not here to teach you anything. He's more like a human sacrifice. In Calvin, all the sins of man are put into Christ, and he's literally cast into hell. And now, God just picks who gets into heaven. The other thing that people associate with Calvinism is this idea of total depravity, which is sort of along these same lines, which is just, there's nothing good about human beings. They're prone to all kinds of sin. They're prone to hatred of God and so forth.
So by emulating Jesus, there's no way to save yourself. There's no ability for course correction. Some of us go to heaven and some of us go to hell, or do we all go to heaven because Jesus is in hell?
Some of us go to hell too, and it might be me and you.
Well, who determines that? Ben Sass? Or is it determined by your perceived worth on earth, meaning your financial portfolio? Or dare we say it, your blonde hair and your blue eyes? Could this be how they bring Ayn Rand into the philosophy, with her philosophy of the producers and the takers? Meaning the wealthy and the producers are saved and the takers are damned?
You have to wonder if that's what's being discussed behind the scenes, but I haven't read any specific explanation for it. I think it's just kind of the caprice of God. I would repeat just one more time, this kind of view is not synonymous with Protestantism. There are a number of Protestant sects that strongly oppose it.
But Calvinism is running through the Westminster Theological Seminary that Ben Sasse is the director of. So Calvinism is running in the veins of somebody who could be the next president of the United States. We need to do an entire episode just on why we think the establishment has a plan to roll out Ben Sasse in 2016. But for now, let's focus on this, on American Calvinism.
Dave Brett, again, he calls himself a fairly orthodox Calvinist. And Calvinism has always been a political weapon, if we can go back again. And it's not just the usury issue. It was Calvinism or Puritanism in different places. It was really the leading edge of the Protestant Revolution, which the whole thing is based on warfare and looting. You've got William of Orange, who's a Calvinist. He overthrows the Spanish king in the Netherlands to lay the groundwork for the Dutch Empire. And then in England, you get Cromwell, who overthrows and executes King Charles. Check out, Lester Tarpley has an article called How the Venetian System Was Transplanted into England, which is very rich with this kind of history. And the Protestant Revolution, in my view, consists of murdering and pillaging and privatizing church property and overturning all the laws that were designed to protect the underclass.
Would you mind getting into the history of how this works in the 20th century?
Okay. Well, in Puritanism, obviously, it's important just in America in the colonial and pre-colonial period. People would associate it with the Scarlet Letter and these hellfire preachers like Jonathan Edwards.
That's exactly the image I have in my mind of Calvinism, the Scarlet Letter.
Mm-hmm. But again, it serves a political purpose. The Puritans are the big enablers of the slave trade, which seems ironic, but, if you look at the doctrine we're going through before, it's not. They're very pro-British.
Great Americans, aren't they?
In researching this, one thing that was interesting was that Aaron Burr is the grandson of Jonathan Edwards, the Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God author. So you've got this best-selling preacher who's telling you God is going to cast you into hell at any second, and he's the grandfather of Aaron Burr.
So a man once tried for treason was a big Calvinist. I always say we should bring back some of these trials for treason, starting with all these guys using the image of being American to take down what's left of our country and our way of life.
Sure. I mean, it just shows that there's a line of descent here. And Burr founds the Chase Manhattan Bank. He murders Alexander Hamilton. He literally tries to sell Louisiana to the British.
That's so wild. He was the founder of Chase Manhattan Bank? I did not know that.
Through the Manhattan Company, where he basically establishes the Manhattan Company as a way to try to take the credit of the first bank of the United States, established by Hamilton. He says he's going to use it for water projects. He turns it into like a public-private partnership scheme. And actually, the Chase Manhattan Bank headquarters still keeps Burr's dueling pistols as like a bloody relic in their trophy room.
That's outrageous.
And I think what kind of smothers Puritanism for a time is, in fact, the influence of Hamilton, who's Burr's victim, and he was sort of the founder of what is now called the American system of political economy.
Once again, the American system of political economy is a real thing. It's just been buried for a reason. I urge people to research it. It's so funny that America's had this continuous enemy, in a way, now from Aaron Burr down to Jamie Dimon.
So Hamilton's legacy, which includes the first bank of the United States, it lifts up the living standards of the country. I mean, it gets us out from under the debt of the Revolutionary War. All of a sudden, people are involved in building canals and bridges and working in factories. And I think it just gives the people in the colonies this new set of expectations about their role in the universe and where they go from this Puritan idea of man as just this lowly worm into the idea of man having some kind of a right or a duty to develop the earth and to share in the wealth. Neoliberalism or the Austrian school of Dave Brett and Ben Sasse and Ron Paul is what the founders knew as British free trade or British imperialism.
Wow, that's really heavy. We have to take a quick break now, but I can't wait to continue with exactly this point. about how the Austrian School of Economics and Free Trade that Dave Bratt and Ben Sasse live by was what the Founding Fathers referred to as British imperialism. That's the whole deal right there, Kyle. See you on the other side of the break. This is United Front Radio.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.tv.
Welcome back to the second half of United Front Radio, where we are continuing to examine a new pattern in American politics that we call theocratic libertarianism, and the dangers of the Calvinist religious threads that underpin its philosophy. Before the break, we left off with the Austrian School of Economics as preached by the libertarians, being un-American, versus our own economic school called the American System of Economics. This is a real school of economics, and it has been responsible for our greatest periods of economic growth and stability, but it's just been buried by the powers that be. There's a reason for that. So if you're American, be American, not Austrian. Before the break, Kyle was saying that the Austrian school in free trade that Dave Bratt and Ben Sasse live by was what the Founding Fathers referred to as British imperialism. Billionaire oligarchs who do not have your best interest at heart pour money into propaganda, and especially for the purposes of what we're talking about here today, they pour money into academia. Because of this, now everyone thinks free trade is normal, and nobody has ever heard of the American system. Ben Sasse and Dave Bratt are both in academic institutions that were given funding to push a foreign economic system that punishes the average American and gives billionaires a free ride. Disagreeing with the Austrian school does not mean that you are a socialist or a communist. It means that you are a traditional American. So don't be fooled by this form of fascism that will be sold to you wrapped in a flag and carrying a Bible.
Right, and free trade throughout history kind of comes and goes with people like Andrew Jackson bringing it back in. Calvinism it's important in the founding of Harvard and Princeton and Yale and these kind of places. The Princeton Theological Seminary, where Dave Bratt got his master's in divinity, it's now independent of Princeton University, but it started out as the core of the university. Princeton was founded basically as a theological seminary. And Westminster Theological Seminary, Ben Sasse's, where he's a director, also came out of Princeton, but it broke off because the members, this group of people sort of wanted an even more radical Calvinist doctrine. So they created this Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. They bring in these Dutch Calvinist theologians. There's one guy named Cornelius Van Til that's pretty important. Mm-hmm. The Westminster Seminary, their founding document, or their sort of whole basis, is the Westminster Confession of Faith. This was written by a bunch of Scottish Puritans who were trying to reform or take over, really, the Church of England. Now, the Confession of Faith, it goes through all of this sola stuff and the double predestination.
What I found really interesting are these confessions that he had to sign in order to be the director of the Westminster Theological Seminary, especially the one stating that the Pope is the Antichrist, as he runs for office in a state that is 25% Catholic, and 30% of America is Catholic. So if this scoundrel is deciding to run for president, I think this is very important to expose.
Yeah, and we're talking about Ben Sasse here, he's the director of the Westminster Seminary in California. And so even if you look on their website, they have a page called, I think, Doctrinal Standards. It shows, all board members and faculty basically have to sign in writing their endorsement of the Westminster Confession of Faith.
Did they take the confessions down off their website recently to protect Sasse because he is currently running for Senate?
No, but they excised out from, they don't say, we've got an updated version. They took out the part on their website that says the Pope of Rome cannot be the head of the church, but he's the Antichrist and the son of perdition and all this stuff.
Yeah, I saw that was there one day and then gone the next.
I didn't notice that. Yeah. Calling the Pope the Antichrist should give pause to anybody, not just Catholics, as to the sanity of a person like Ben Sasse.
Calling the Pope the Antichrist is one thing, But can you explain why it's necessarily bad to want to break the power of the Catholic Church?
It's hard to transpose our values today onto those times. I mean, you and I wouldn't like the Catholic Church running our government. In the time of Calvin or Luther, the church was the alternative to feudalism. And the Protestant Revolution it overthrows what was really a stable system that offers, education and food and employment and is housing people in monasteries.
That's similar to today. By throwing the government into total chaos, it only benefits our feudal overlords on Wall Street.
Yeah, I think that's the exact analogy. Now we can look back at history that was written by the victors and just say, oh, Martin Luther, he was just so upset about the church granting indulgences. But it doesn't account for the things that the church did right. In the same way you can make a very bleak case about the U.S. government as being corrupt and hopeless and just say we need to get rid of it.
As many people are saying today.
Yeah. With the Catholic Church, why does it continue to be so demonized and attacked in America without going into any of the scandals?
Let's talk about the things worth maintaining.
Well, one is that it acts as a positive political force, not so much in America, but if you're looking at South America or the parts of Europe that are still Catholic, it's a force for stability, for cultural cohesion, for economic development and alleviation of poverty and so forth. The other thing is the theology. Like the Orthodox Christian churches, it's not so obsessed as is Calvinism or even Protestantism with this topic of salvation. And instead, I would say it stresses morality and good works and truth and charity. To take one example, the Pope during the Vietnam era was Paul VI. He held this as a big event to demand an end to the Vietnam War through political negotiation. He puts out this encyclical called Populorum Progressio, and the thesis of which is basically that development is the new name for peace. And he basically stresses the need for third world economic development. In the same time, what does Billy Graham, the Protestant evangelical, do? He advises Nixon to blow up the levees in North Vietnam to kill 1 million people and just end the war through genocide.
Right.
So the Catholic Church obviously has its low points, but on the whole, especially around the world, represents morality and wields some serious political power, I think.
Pope Francis represents everything the elite business and financial community don't want. The right to employment, the responsibility to the elderly and the third world. You're not going to get that message coming out of Ben Sasse or Dave Bratt. They're not going to look through the Bible and say, you know what, maybe I am my brother's keeper, and we've got to figure out what to do about Africa. They don't care about that. Forget Africa. Sasse is not his brother's keeper here at home. This is not Christianity for me.
Yeah, I think the whole thing is very superficial. But, then you're going to get the backlash of a lot of secular people on the left who just say, oh, this confirms everything I always thought about Christianity, which is that it's just evil and hypocritical.
And if you look at the Christianity of George W. Bush going to war, or Ben Sasse or Dave Bratt, it doesn't look like a very appealing religion. And it will prove what's already in the left's mind. But Sasse and Bratt, they're just godly free market guys, nothing to see here, move along. So I've been saying for a while now how my hope is to teach Americans how to research a candidate for themselves, and it couldn't be easier. The first step is to go to fec.gov. This will only take you 10 minutes, and I suggest doing this before you listen to hours of any opinion. First, go to fec.gov, that's the Federal Election Commission. All campaign contributions are public, by law. When you get to the website, there's a search bar in the top right corner. Put the candidate's name into the search bar, for instance, Ben Sasse. Then it's going to take you to a page of a long list of everything that Ben Sasse ever filed. Hit on the first link. Then you will see a link labeled Itemized Individual Contributions. Click on that, and everything will be right there. This is how you do research, not by listening to endless hours of YouTube. You go to the source documents, which are available on .gov websites. Certain things have to be available by law, like campaign contributions. Then start to learn how to read a campaign contribution list. Under many contributions, you'll notice the word homemaker under employer. There'll be many contributions from homemakers, and usually that's the wife, because there's somebody who wants to make double the maximum donation. The maximum donation for a Senate candidate in Nebraska is $2,600. If they want to give $5,200, then they have their wife donate as well. But that's not the biggest point. The biggest point is to learn how to read the column marked description, because you'll notice in Ben Sasse's list of campaign contributions, There's many that have the description of bundled by the Senate Conservatives Fund or bundled by the Club for Growth. Nearly 3/4 of his donation are bundled by either of these two nefarious organizations. And then, once you see that, it's your responsibility to look in to what these organizations are and what they represent. And do they have your best interests at heart?
And Daniela had to kind of twist my arm to get on this website because, you kind of just want to go with your gut on a lot of things, but it really is, it's an interesting thing to read through, and it's also a reminder of just all of these small things that the federal government actually does well. Like, the reason that that, the CEO of the Intel Corporation donated a maximum contribution to Ben Sasse is because he has to do it or he goes to jail. It's just the FEC laws. I mean, there are a lot of problems with campaign finance and stuff, but there is actually a pretty good system to report these kinds of things.
People are under the impression that the federal government is completely cloaked in secrecy, but the most underutilized sites are the .gov sites. For instance, read the PDFs on the .gov sites. Like on whitehouse.gov, you can read Obama's budget submission to Congress. And for good or bad, you'll learn a lot when you see the hard numbers on paper. Go read the NDAA and all the rest of this crap. It's very, very empowering. Except for what's classified as national security, every government PDF is online, and people will say, oh, they're just going to have what they don't mind you seeing or they want you to see. Not true. Not true. Go to departmentofjustice.com, DOJ.com, and put PDFs into the search column. You're going to find a lot of stuff. Like, for instance, do you know that our largest department is Health and Human Services, not the Department of Defense? So when you get a lefty squawking to you about our defense budget, then you can tell them that it's only 30% of our budget. And then you'll get people who say we spend too much on health and human services, but go to hhs.gov and find out all the things that HHS is responsible for.
The only reason we know what Ben Sasse's undergrad theses were is because he had to enter them into the congressional record to get this job at HHS. So there are just all these, there's a lot of information that you can find in official sources that you're not going to find in the conspiracy world, for lack of a better word.
And then people latch on to certain radio hosts because they identify with their personality. But do people realize that hosts like Glenn Beck, Mark Levin, Laura Ingraham, Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh are pay-to-play? The Heritage Foundation pays each of these hosts millions of dollars a year to run their agenda. That's why you're not getting a genuine opinion based on facts, neither from left-wing personalities. I'm just using these guys as an example funded by the Heritage Foundation tonight because we're talking about Dave Bratt's victory in Virginia over Eric Cantor. And what happened there? How did he do it with only $138,000? The answer is he had the pay-to-play media hosts on his side because the Heritage Foundation wanted Dave Bratt.
And I think that'll show you the difference between, just sort of the individual feelings of rich people versus this sort of organized strategic funding of a candidate that's expected to win. And we can get to this. One thing that we should make a distinction about, we could get into this, is that Sasse raised a ton of money. He raised $2 million and broke all of the state fundraising records in Nebraska, whereas Dave Bratt was able to defeat the majority leader of the House with like 138,000, or no, I think it ended up being like 200,000, but with what was a pretty modest campaign financing. And I think what this also shows, and maybe you can get into this, is it shows how the right-wing media is this pay-to-play system where it can, you can go directly into the campaign, like with Ben Sasse, where he's got to flood the market with advertising and with sort of this awareness marketing stuff, whereas with Dave Bratt, it was much more about just defeating Eric Cantor and how he was able to do that through the supposedly free media, which is actually being paid by his supporters outside of the reach of the FEC.
Right, that's a very good point. That's another new paradigm we're dealing here with Dave Bratt. His election is suddenly out of the control of the FEC, which means things aren't public. To me, also, Dave Bratt winning with $138,000 proves what we've always been saying, that campaign finance reform isn't the main issue. billionaires will find alternative means outside the FEC to get their guy in.
Or with Dave Bratt, I think it's more important because he didn't raise, you could say that Ben Sass bought the election with all this money he raised. With Dave Bratt, go to davebradforcongress.com, and then if you click on media, which is on the top line, there are 5 zillion pages of links to articles about him. And remember, this is a primary race for the House of Representatives, and going all the way back to January, he's got January 8, 2014, Washington Post. Will Cantor have a primary fight on his hands? And we're supposed to believe, Wall Street Journal, majority leader gets a primary challenger. It's just this idea, it's just this little professor from Randolph-Macon College. That's not it at all.
That's why Bratt won, because he had billionaire-backed media coverage. National media coverage. Little professor from Randolph-Macon College. Ha! What a joke.
Right. Breitbart covered him frequently. Like you said, the National Review. Glenn Beck gave him a 13-minute interview 2 days before the primary.
People get their most important information, who they vote for, from crooked journalists. One day it's Bush. One day it's Hillary Clinton, yawn. One day it's Obama. One day it's Dave Bratt.
It's product placement. You can look at we were talking the other day, Glenn Beck had a list of the primary candidacies that he was supporting back in March, I think. It was kind of like primaries to look out for, and Dave Bratt was one of them, but it's just one by one. Tom Cotton is another guy we've been talking about as fitting into this same picture. But it's he had 12 different primary races where the incumbent was being painted as this corrupt insider, and that the quote-unquote outsider was being heavily funded by these Heritage Foundation PACs.
I can just see it now in 2016. They're going to run somebody like Hillary, and she's going to represent the big government insider we've all come to hate. And she's going to run against the outsider, Ben Sass, who's going to come with a stick of wheat in his mouth and look like the alternative.
Well, and if we look at, it's just funny how the actual economic policies, to the extent that they've even been forced to talk about them, of Ben Sass or Dave Bratt or any of these guys, it's the same thing as, the most insider Republicans. It's basically free trade, austerity, cut the capital gains tax, cut the, taxes, the inheritance tax, all this kind of stuff, just basically everything for the rich and nothing for the poor.
It's all just image. Bratt's just saying words like crony capitalism. He's saying things like jail bankers, but that's a red flag because he's not proposing anything realistic. Like, how about regulating bankers? What are we going to do? Go to Wall Street, round everybody up and put them in jail? Okay, that might sound good, but it's just not realistic. When you hear things that aren't realistic, let it be a red flag.
Right. Where's the Wall Street sales tax? Or where is the Republican candidate that is going to call for a protective tariff? This is a pro-business idea. If you want to manufacture something in the United States, you need a tariff, or somebody in a low-wage country is going to do it cheaper than you. So where is the populist Republican that says...
A protective tariff was the Republican mantra for much of our American history.
Yeah, that was the founding of the Republican Party was based on the protective tariff and some other issues. But, right, where is the... And one thing that's interesting is that the last time I heard someone call for this was Donald Trump, of all people, was calling for and who else did? Was Mitt Romney, if you can believe that, was calling for a tariff against China.
Yeah, right, when he was calling them currency speculators.
Manipulators. Right. So, that's not the most constructive way to go about any of that, but...
You're not hearing anything programmatic coming out of Sass or Bratt. All they're talking about is destruction. Destroying Obamacare, destroying this, destroying that, destroying the post office, which is lovely. What the hell is rural America going to do without the post office? But they're just small-town American boys who love America. It's all just cuts, cuts, cuts.
Right. Where is the revenue coming from to fix bridges and to keep people on food stamps who have been chronically unemployed? But you see a lot of these people who are the sort of radical right-wing populists in the Tea Party, who like Mike Lee, even and then you want to talk about like Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio or these kind of guys who are Mormons or these sort of radical, holy rolling Christians. It's interesting that a lot of them do have this same, it's not the same as Sass and Brett, but they have this sort of religious veneer driving them. But I think the difference, and I think the reason that they can sort of come in and make the Tea Party respectable is because they've got this sort of these elite backgrounds to some extent, and they have these pretensions to intellectualism. So it's kind of like, if you combine Mitt Romney and Rand Paul, and Ron Paul, so it's all of the austerity with this, where they're able to sort of float above the muck and mire. Ben Sass isn't going to have to base his votes on the 9/11 truth community or something like that. He's going to be able to come in and go after the same kind of people that Romney had, but add to them, and I think this is probably the strategy, add to them the Southern evangelicals, whatever kind of Midwestern Protestants they can get, including these sort of Reagan Democrats, if there are any of those lying around, of people who are sort of like Democratic values voters that can be tricked into that. You could not assemble that coalition behind Rand Paul because he's too secular and he's too wild about this Austrian school stuff.
And his name's Rand.
Yeah.
Sass is much more electable than any of these guys we've seen. He gave a TED Talk. The TED Talk will give him some left cover among the trendy, pseudo-intellectual liberals. Some of them will fall for it, too.
And what has the right wing been hearing for the last 8 years? Oh my God, Barack Obama's a radical socialist Marxist.
First pro-Wall Street radical Marxist I've ever heard of.
Hanging out with weathermen and all this stuff. And a lot of this stuff is actually quite true.
Obama's a socialist in the same way that Ben Sass is a Christian.
It's not socialism or revolutionary Marxism in the way that you'd think about it. But I'm just saying there is some basis for people to be making these kinds of claims. It's a big distraction, but that's what they've been fed for the last 8 years. And so then in comes Ben Sass with the city on the hill, Puritan imagery. He's just, lily white, and he's going to come in and whiteify the White House.
It's the next great 180.
Yep. But I think that, and so let's get to the Calvinism stuff. I think what makes it kind of interesting is that his brand of Calvinism, I would call it theocratic libertarianism. We talked about that guy, Cornelius Van Til, who's one of the founders of this Westminster Seminary. He gets popularized by a guy named Rusas Rushdoony, who is, you should look this guy up. He's very interesting and little known.
And the most racist bastard of all time. People just need to Google Rushdoony, because we can never say the things he's said on air.
Rushdoony was influential to this cabal of Christian right leaders that you see, in the 80s, like people like Jerry Falwell or Pat Robertson or Tim LaHaye, who's the author of these Left Behind books about the rapture, James Dobson. So that whole crew of people. This group sort of...
What was that big, crazy national organization that LaHaye founded?
He founded the Council for National Policy.
Right. Remember I was saying I wanted to do an entire episode on the Council for National Policy, but it's so secret we couldn't find any information on it? Ha! It's the dark, secret faction of the Heritage Foundation, with a super secret member list.
Yeah, and it seems very odd when you look at who comes into this thing, because their guests include people like Irving Kristol, who's the godfather of neoconservatism, or among them Donald Rumsfeld, Eric Prince from Blackwater, Oliver North. And then if you go sort of down to the gutters, you'll find people like Phyllis Schlafly, Larry Pratt, Stan Monteith, Joel Skousen, these people who are...
Sounds like the entire cast of InfoWars.
That's who it is. And you've got the Christian right, TV televangelists, deep state operatives, and these sort of radical, libertarian populists. And a few interesting things that people should check out on YouTube. One is, you can find it if you look at like Alex Jones, COINTELPRO, is an interview between Alex Jones and Charlotte Iserbyt, who used to be in the Department of Education. And she brings up the Council for National Policy and is basically saying it's a fraud. And Alex freaks out, and then later he's talking to Joel Skousen, who's a Council for National Policy member, and just saying, oh, blah, 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 blah. I said, this is just some...
Well, that's what really frightens me, that Alex is going to form an alliance with Sean Hannity and Glenn Beck over Dave Bratt and Ben Sass's candidacies. He supported Rand Paul, who comes out of the exact same think tanks as Ben Sass and Dave Bratt. Oh man, people are really going to fall for these two government insiders. It's all a fix. We're in so much trouble. It's like when Whoopi Goldberg said to Demi Moore in the movie Ghost, Molly, you in danger, girl. America, you in danger, girl. I don't think anybody wants the kind of fascist future Sass and Bratt have in mind for us.
And this is not... I really don't think that this is like a marriage of convenience where, like, oh, these independent, Ron and Rand Paul people are, like, coming over to the side of Mike Lee and Marco Rubio and stuff because, well, it's a way to get power. There's some shared principles. No, these guys are inseparable from the beginning. It's the only thing that makes them different is that the Alex Jones show is scrubbed through this filter of 9/11 truth and some of these other conspiracy issues. But take those away and you've got Sean Hannity.
That's a very good point, because Alex has come to be, for most people, the trusted source that can cut through and see through the illusions, like the work he did on 9/11 truth. So when he comes out and says these candidates are real, people are going to believe it.
You got to give the guy credit, and he certainly earned a lot of the capital that he's got with people, or earned a lot of the trust that he's got with people through the good work that he's done over the years. But okay, so back to Rushdoony for a second. His main financier is this guy, Howard Amundsen. Howard Amundsen is, like I said, he was a heir to this home savings bank fortune. He's a pretty interesting and sort of eccentric character. But he was also on the board of directors of the Council for National Policy. And you can see that the real money seems to connect to this Calvinism thing. And that the money going into the CNP comes from the Rockefeller Foundation, and I believe they're all Presbyterians. The Richard Mellon Scaife is a big funder of a lot of this kind of stuff. Sun Myung Moon, or the Moonies, who's that crazy Korean religious guy who owns the Washington Times. You've got this sort of cabal of eccentric billionaires who are funding all of this stuff from top to bottom. I should interject really quick that one of the main founders of the Heritage Foundation was Paul Weyrich, who is also sort of like a Calvinist, holy rolling preacher who founded this moral majority movement with Jerry Falwell. So, all the way to the beginning, it's these sort of fake, radical, fire and brimstone Christians who are bringing the big money into the modern Republican Party.
You sent me something very interesting on Wikipedia that surprised me. In 2007, Chuck Schumer and Lindsey Graham proposed a bill that would impose large tariffs on Chinese imports if that country didn't increase the value of its currency. In response to that bill, the Club for Growth, who, by the way, are Ben Sass's largest PAC bundlers. Again, please verify what I'm saying by checking out his campaign contributions on fec.gov. In response to this bill, the Club for Growth gathered the signatures of 1,028 paid economists who stated their opposition to protectionist policies against China. So sometimes even dirty guys like Schumer and Graham can be better than the Club for Growth or the Heritage Foundation. Sometimes politicians want to go off the leash every once in a while, but these PACs make sure they're there to rein them back in. Could you explain really quickly, Kyle, why people should even want protective tariffs? I think people have forgotten what the concept even means.
Basically, it's a tax on the importation of goods or services, however you want to apply it. Take the steel industry. The U.S. used to be number one in steel, U.S. Steel and Bethlehem Steel and all these kinds of things. The reason that we were able to do that is because we protected our borders against the importation of cheap steel. Now the number one steel manufacturer in the world is this Mittal, which is it's based in Luxembourg, but all of their manufacturing is in India, in Poland, and even I think Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine does some of this stuff. It's basically, if someone can do it at a lower cost, you're not going to compete. Look at Benton Harbor. Whirlpool is the world's #1 manufacturer of home appliances, based in Benton Harbor, which is, where Reverend Pinckney is.
Kyle, sorry to interrupt, but I just noticed that we're out of time. Thank you to everybody who spent the hour with us. Have a blessed evening. You've been listening to United Front Radio at ucy.tv/UFR.